She knew now that a plain, face-to-face talk with her employer was essential. Her conscience, her peace of mind, her sanity, her sense of duty all demanded this. Deliberately, and she was sure rightly, she had never once risked a word with the child herself. Danger lay that way. The danger of emphasizing something in the child's mind that was best left ignored. But with Colonel Masters, who paid her for her services, believed in her integrity, trusted her, with him there must be an immediate explanation. An interview was absurdly difficult. In the first place because he loathed and avoided such occasions. Secondly, because he was so exceedingly impervious to approach, being so rarely even visible at all. At night he came home late. In the mornings no one dared go near him. He expected the little household, once its routine established, to run itself. The only inmate who dared beard him was Mrs. O'Reilly, who periodically, once every 6 months, walked straight into his study, gave notice, received an addition to her wages, and then left him alone for another 6 months. Madame Jodzka, knowing his habits, waylaid him in the hall next morning, while Monica was lying down before lunch as usual. He was on his way out, and she had been watching from the upper landing. She had hardly set eyes on him since her return from Warsaw. His lean, upright figure, his dark, emotionless face, she thought magnificent. He was the perfect expression of the soldier. Her heart fluttered as she raced downstairs. Her carefully prepared sentences, however, evaporated when he stopped and looked at her. A jumble of wild words pouring from her in confused English instead. He cut her rigmarole short, though he listened politely enough at first. "I'm so glad you were able to come back to us, as I told you. Monica missed you very much. She has something now she plays with." "The very thing," he interrupted. "No doubt the kind of toy she needs. Your excellent judgment. Please tell me if there's anything else you think." And he half turned as though to move away. "But I didn't get it. It's horrible, horrible." Colonel Masters uttered one of his rare laughs. "Of course, all children's toys are horrible, but if she's pleased with it, I haven't seen it. I'm no judge. If you can buy something better." And he shrugged his shoulders. "I didn't buy it," she cried desperately. "It was brought. It makes sounds by itself. Syllables. I've seen it move itself. It's a doll." He turned from the front door, which he had just reached, as though he had been shot. The skin held a sudden pallor beneath the flesh, and something contradicted the blazing eyes. Something seemed to shrink. "A doll," he repeated, in a very quiet voice. "You said a doll." But his eyes and face disconcerted her, so that she merely gave a fumbling account of a parcel that had been brought. His question about a parcel he had ordered strictly to be destroyed added to her confusion. "Wasn't it?" he asked in a rasping whisper, as though a disobeyed order seemed incredible. "It was thrown away, I believe," she prevaricated, unable to meet his eyes, anxious to protect the cook as well. "I think Monica perhaps found it." She despised her lack of courage, but his intensity scattered her wits. She was conscious, moreover, of a strange desire not to give him pain, as though his safety and happiness, not Monica's, were at stake. "It talks as well as moves," she cried desperately, forcing herself at last to look at him. Colonel Masters seemed to stiffen. His breath caught oddly. "You say Monica has it, plays with it. You've seen movement and heard sounds like syllables." He asked the questions in a low voice, almost as though talking to himself. "You've listened," he whispered. Unable to find convincing words, she bowed her head, while some terror in him came across to her like a blast of icy wind. The man was afraid in his heart. Instead, however, of some explosive reply by way of blame or criticism, he spoke quietly, even calmly. You did right to come and tell me this. Quite right. Adding then in so low a tone that she barely caught the ominous words. For I have been expecting something of the sort. Sooner or later it was bound to come. The voice dying away into the handkerchief he put to his face. And abruptly then, as though aware of an appeal for sympathy, an emotional reaction swept her fear away. Stepping closer, she looked her employer straight in the eyes. "See the child for yourself," she said with sudden firmness. "Come and listen with me. Come into the bedroom." She saw him stagger. For a moment he said nothing. "Who?" he then asked, the low voice unsteady. "Who brought that parcel?" "A man, I believe." There was a pause that seemed like minutes before his next question. "White?" he asked. "Or black?" "Dark," she told him. "Very dark." He was shaking like a leaf. The skin of his face blanched. He leaned against the door, wilted, limp. Unless she somehow took command, there threatened a collapse she did not wish to witness. "You shall come with me tonight," she said firmly, "and we shall listen together. Wait till I return now. I go for brandy." And a minute later, as she came back breathless and watched him gulp down half a tumblerful, she knew that she had done right in telling him. His obedience proved it, though it seemed strange that cowardice should borrow from its like to produce courage. "Tonight," she repeated. "Tonight, after your bridge, we meet in the corridor outside the bedroom. I shall be there at 12:30. He pulled himself into an upright position, staring at her fixedly, making a movement of his head, half bow, half nod. 12:30, he muttered, in the passage outside the bedroom door. And using his stick heavily rather, he opened the door and passed out into the drive. She watched him go, aware that her fear had changed to pity, aware also that she watched the stumbling gait of a man too conscience-stricken to know a moment's peace, too frightened even to think of God. Madame Jodzka kept the appointment. She had eaten no supper, but had stayed in her room, praying. She had first put Monica to bed. "My doll!" the child pleaded, good as gold after being tucked up. "I must have my doll, or else I'll never get to sleep." And Madame Jodzka had brought it with reluctant fingers, placing it on the night table beside the bed. "She'll sleep quite comfortably here, Monica darling. Why not leave her outside the sheets?" It had been carefully mended, she noticed, patched together with pins and stitches. The child grabbed at it. "I want her in bed beside me, close against me," she said, with a happy smile. "We tell each other stories. If she's too far away, I can't hear what she says." And she seized it with a cuddling pleasure that made the woman's heart turn cold. "Of course, darling. If it helps you to fall asleep quickly, you shall have it." And Monica did not see the trembling fingers, nor notice the horror in the face and voice. Indeed, hardly was the doll against her cheek on the pillow, her fingers half stroking the flaxen hair and pink wax cheeks. Then her eyes closed, a sigh of deep content breathed out, and Monica was asleep. Madame Jodzka, fearful of looking behind her, tiptoed to the door and left the room. In the passage, she wiped a cold sweat from her forehead. "God bless her and protect her," her heart murmured, "and may God forgive me if I've sinned." She kept the appointment. She knew Colonel Masters would keep it too. It had been a long wait from 8 o'clock till after midnight. With great determination, she had kept away from the bedroom door, fearful lest she might hear a sound that would necessitate action on her part. She went to her room and stayed there. But praying exhausted itself, for it both excited and betrayed her. If her God could help, a brief request alone was needed. To go on praying for help hour by hour was not only an insult to her deity, but it also wore her out physically. She stopped, therefore, and read some pages of a Polish saint which she did not understand. Later, she fell into a state of horrified, nervous drowse. In due course, she slept. A noise awoke her, steps going softly past her door. A glance at her watch showed 11 o'clock. The steps, though stealthy, were familiar. Mrs. O'Reilly was waddling up to bed. The sounds died away. Madame Jodzka, a trifle ashamed, though she hardly knew why, returned to her Polish saint, yet determined to keep her ears open, then slept again. What woke her a second time she could not tell. She was startled. She listened. The night was unpleasantly still. The house quiet as the grave. No casual traffic passed. No wind stirred the gloomy evergreens in the drive. The world outside was silent. And then, as she saw by her watch that it was some minutes after midnight, a sharp click became audible that acted like a pistol shot to her keyed-up nerves. It was the front door, closing softly. Steps followed across the hall below, then up the stairs, unsteadily a little. Colonel Masters had come in. He was coming up slowly, unwillingly she felt, to keep the appointment. Madame Jodzka started from her chair, looked in the glass, mumbled a quick, confused prayer, and opened her door into the dark passage. She stiffened physically and mentally. Now he'll hear and perhaps see for himself, she thought. And God help him. She marched along the passage and reached the door of Monica's bedroom, listening with such intentness that she seemed to hear only the confused running murmur of her own blood. Having reached the appointed spot, she stood stock still and waited while his steps approached. A moment later his bulk blocked the passage, shown up as a dark shadow by the light in the hall below. This bulk came nearer, came right up to her. She believed she said, "Good evening," and that he mumbled something about, "I said I'd come. Damned nonsense," or words to that effect. Whereupon the couple stood side by side in the darkened silence of the corridor, remote from the rest of the house, and waited without further words. They stood, shoulder to shoulder, outside the door of Monica's bedroom. Her heart was knocking against her side. She heard his breathing. There came a whiff of spirits, of stale tobacco, smoke. His outline seemed to shift against the wall unsteadily. He moved his feet, and a sudden extraordinary wave of emotion swept over her, half of protective maternal yearning, half almost of sexual desire, so that for a passing instant she burned to take him in her arms and kiss him savagely, and at the same time shield him from some appalling danger his blunt ignorance laid him open to. With revulsion, pity, and a sense of sin and passion, she acknowledged this odd, sudden weakness in herself. But the face of the Warsaw priest flashed across her befuddled mind the next instant. There was evil in the air. This meant the devil. She felt herself trembling dreadfully, shaking in her shoes, losing her balance, her whole body leaning over, but leaning in his direction. A moment more and she must have fallen towards him, dropped into his arms. A sound broke the silence, and she drew up just in time. It came from beyond the door, from inside the bedroom. "Hark," she whispered, her hand upon his arm, and while he made no movement, spoke no word, she saw his head and shoulders bend down toward the panel of the closed door. There was a noise upon the other side. There were noises. Monica's voice distinctly recognizable. Another, slighter, shriller sound accompanying it, breaking in upon it, answering it. 2 voices. "Listen," she repeated in a whisper scarcely audible, and felt his warm hand grip her own so fiercely that it hurt her. No words were distinguishable at first. Just these odd, broken sounds of 2 separate voices in that dark corridor of the silent house. The voice of a child, and the other a strange, faint, hardly a human sound, while yet a voice. "Quel bon Dieu," she began, then faltered, breath failing her, for she saw Colonel Masters stoop down suddenly and do the last thing that would have occurred to her as likely. He put his eye to the keyhole and kept it there steadily for the best part of a minute, his hand still gripping her own firmly. He knelt on one knee to keep his balance. The sounds had ceased. No movement now stirred inside the room. The nightlight, she knew, would show him clearly the pillows of the bed, Monica's head, the doll in her arms. Colonel Masters must see clearly anything there was to see, and he yet gave no sign that he saw anything. She experienced a queer sensation for a few seconds, almost as though she had perhaps imagined everything and proved herself a consummate, idiotic, hysterical fool. For a few seconds this ghastly thought flashed over her, the odd silence emphasizing it. Had she been, after all, just a crazy lunatic? Had her senses all deceived her? Why should he see nothing, make no sign? Why had the voices, ceased? Not a murmur of any sort was audible in the room. Then Colonel Masters, suddenly releasing his grip of her hand, shuffled onto both feet and stood up straight, while in the same instant she herself stiffened, trying to prepare for the angry scorn, the contemptuous abuse he was about to pour upon her, protecting herself against this attack, expecting it. She was the more amazed at what she did hear. I saw it, came in a strangled whisper. I saw it walk. She stood, paralyzed. It's watching me, he added, scarcely audible. Me. The revulsion of feeling at first left her speechless. It was the sheer terror in his strangled whisper that restored a measure of self-possession to her. Yet it was he who found words first. Awful, whispered words. Words spoken to himself, it seemed, more than to her. It's what I've always feared. I knew it must come someday. Yet not like this. Not this way. Then immediately the voice in the room became audible, and it was a sweet and gentle voice. Sincere and natural, with feeling in it. Monica's childish voice, pleading. Don't go. Don't leave me. Come back into bed. Please. An incomprehensible sound followed, as though by way of answer. There were syllables in that faint, creaky tone Madame Jodzka recognized, but syllables she could not comprehend. They seemed to enter her like points of ice. She froze, and facing her stood the motionless, inanimate figure. Through the darkness, though the darkness hid its expression, the solid bulk of him, his outline, then leaned over towards her, his lips so close to her own face that, as he spoke, she felt the breath upon her cheek. Lager, she heard him repeat the syllables to himself again and again. Revenge in Hindustani. He drew a long, anguished breath. The sounds sank into her like drops of poison. The syllables she had heard several times already, but had not understood. At last, she understood their meaning. Revenge. I must go in. Go in. He was mumbling to himself. I must go in and face it. Her intuition was justified. The danger was not for Monica, but for himself. Her sudden protective maternal instinct found its explanation too. The lethal power concentrated in that hideous puppet was aimed at him. He began to edge impetuously past her. No, she cried. I'll go. Let me go in, pushing him aside with all her strength. But his hand was already on the knob, and the next instant the door was open and he was inside the room. On the threshold they stood, still a second side by side, though she was slightly behind, struggling to shove past him and stand protectively in front. She stared across his shoulder, her eyes so wide open that the intense strain to note everything at once threatened to defeat its own end. Sight, nonetheless, worked normally. She saw all there was to see, and that was Nothing. Nothing unusual, that is. Nothing abnormal. Nothing terrifying. So that this second time the threat of anticlimax rose to her mind. Had she worked herself up to this peak of horror merely to behold Monica lying sound asleep in a safe and quiet room? The flickering nightlight revealed no more than a child in natural slumber, without a toy of any sort against her pillow. There stood the glass of water beside the flowers in their saucer, the picture book on the sill of the window within reach. The window opened a little at the bottom, and there also lay the calm face of Monica, with eyes tight shut upon the pillow. Her breathing was deep and regular, no sign of disquiet anywhere, no hint of disturbance that might have accompanied that pleading sentence of 2 minutes ago, except that the bedclothes were perhaps somewhat tumbled. The counterpane humped itself in folds towards the foot of the bed, she noticed, as though Monica, finding it too warm, had tossed it away in sleep. No more than that. In that first moment, Colonel Masters and the governess took in this whole pretty picture complete. The room was so still that the child's breathing was distinctly audible. Their eyes roved all over. Nothing was anywhere in movement. Yet at the same instant, Madame Jodzka became aware that there was movement. Something stirred. The report came perhaps through her skin, for no sense announced it. But it was undeniable. In that still, silent room there was movement somewhere. And with that unreported movement there was danger. Certain, rightly or wrongly, that she herself was safe, also that the quietly sleeping child was safe, she was equally certain that Colonel Masters was the one in danger. She knew that in her very bones. "Wait here by the door," she said, almost peremptorily, as she felt him pushing past her further into the quiet room. "You saw it watching you. It's somewhere. Take care." She clutched at him, but he was already beyond her. "Damn nonsense," he muttered, and strode forward. Never before in her whole life had she admired a man more than in this instant, when she saw him moving towards what she knew to be physical and spiritual danger. Never before, and never again, was such a hideous and dreadful sight to be repeatable in a woman's life. Pity and horror drowned her in a sea of passionate, futile longing. A man going to meet his fate, it flashed over her, was something none without power to help should witness. No human power can stay the courses of the stars. Her eyes rested, as it were by chance, on the crumpled ridges and hollows of the discarded counterpane. These lay by the foot of the bed in shadow, confused a little in their contours and their masses. Had Monica not moved, they must have lain thus till morning. But Monica did move. At this particular moment she turned over in her sleep. She stretched her little legs before settling down in the new position, and this stretching squeezed and twisted the contours of the heavy counterpane at the foot of the bed. The tiny landscape altered thus a fraction. Its immediate details shifted, and an outline, a very small outline, emerged. Hitherto it had lain concealed among the shadows. It emerged now with disconcerting rapidity, as though a spring released it. Out of its nest of darkness it seemed almost to leap forward. Fast it came, supernaturally fast, its velocity actually shocking, for a shock came with it. It was exceedingly small, it was exceedingly dreadful, its head erect and venomous, and the movement of its legs and arms, as of its bitter, glittering eyes, aping humanity. Malignant evil personified and aggressive, shaped itself in this otherwise ridiculous outline. It was the doll. Racing with incredible security across the slippery surface of the crumpled silk counterpane, it dived and climbed and shot forward with an appearance of complete control and deliberate purpose. That it had a definite aim was overwhelmingly obvious. Its fixed, glassy eyes were concentrated upon a point beyond and behind the terrified governess, the point precisely where Colonel Masters, her employer, stood against her shoulder. A frantic, half-protective movement on her part seemed lost in the air. She turned instinctively, putting an arm about his shoulders, which he instantly flung off. "Let the bloody thing come!" he cried. "I'll deal with it!" He thrust her violently aside. The doll came at him, The hinges of its diminutive broken arms and its jointed legs emitted a thin, creaking sound as it came darting. The syllables Madame Jodzka had already heard more than once, syllables she had heard without understanding. Booth Laga, but syllables now packed with awful meaning. Revenge. The sounds hissed and squeaked, yet clear as a bell as the beast advanced at this miraculous speed. Before Colonel Masters could move an inch backwards or forwards in self-protection, before he could command himself to any sort of action, or contrive the smallest measure of self-defense, it was off the bed and at him. It settled. Savagely, its little jaws of tiny make-believe were bitten deep into Colonel Masters' throat, fastened tightly. In a flash this happened. In a flash it was over. In Madame Jodzka's memory it remained like the impression of a lightning flash, simultaneously etched in black and white. It had happened in the present as though it had no past. It came and was gone again. Her faculties, as after a vivid lightning flash, were momentarily paralyzed, without past or present. She had witnessed these awful things, but had not realized them. It was this lack of realization that struck her motionless and dumb. Colonel Masters, on the other hand, stood beside her quietly as though nothing unusual had happened, wholly master of himself, calm, collected. At the moment of attack no sound had left his lips. There had been no gesture, even of defence. Whatever had come he had apparently accepted. The words that now fell from his lips were thus all the more dreadful in their appalling commonplaceness. "Hadn't you better put that counterpane straight a bit? Perhaps." Common sense, as always, enables the gas of hysteria to escape. Madame Jodzka gasped, but she obeyed. Automatically she moved across to do his bidding, yet aware even as she thus moved that he flicked something from his neck, as though a wasp, a mosquito, or some poisonous insect tried to sting him. She remembered no more than that, for he, in his calmness, had contributed nothing else. Fumbling with the folds of slippery counterpane she tried to straighten out, she was startled to find that Monica was sitting up in bed, awake. "Oh, Jodzka, you here?" the child exclaimed innocently, straight out of sleep and using the affectionate nickname. "And Daddy, too! Oh, my goodness!" "Smoothing your bed, darling," she stammered, hardly aware of what she said. "You ought to be asleep. I just looked in to see." She mumbled a few other automatic words. "And Daddy with you," repeated the child excitedly, sleep still about her, wondering what it all meant. "Oh, oh," holding out her arms. This brief exchange of spoken words, though it takes a minute to describe, occurred simultaneously with the action, perhaps 10 seconds all told, for while the governess fumbled with the counterpane, Colonel Masters was in the act of brushing something from his neck. Nothing else was audible, nothing but his quick gasp and sudden intake of breath. But something else, she swears it on her Warsaw priest, was visible. Madame Jodzka maintains by all her gods she saw this other thing. In moments of paralyzing stress it is not the senses that act less speedily nor with less precision. Their action, on the contrary, is intensified and speeded up. What takes longer is the registration of their reports. The numbed brain causes the apparent delay. Realization is slowed down. Madame Jodzka thus only realized a fraction of a second later what her eyes had indubitably witnessed. A dark-skinned arm slanting in through the open window by the bed, and snatching at a small object that lay on the floor after dropping from Colonel Masters' throat, then withdrawing again at lightning speed into the darkness of the night outside. No one but herself apparently had seen this. It was almost supernaturally swift. "And now you'll be asleep again in 2 minutes, lucky Monica," Colonel Masters was whispering over the bed. "I just peeped in to see that you were all right." His voice was thin, dreadfully soundless. Madame Jodzka, against the door, frozen, terrified, looked on and listened. "Are you quite well, Daddy? Sure? I had a dream, but it's gone now." "Splendid. Never better in my life, but better still if I saw you sound asleep. Come now, I'll blow out this silly nightlight, for that's what woke you up, I'll be bound. He blew it out. He and the child blew it out together. The latter with sleepy laughter that then hushed, and Colonel Masters tiptoed to join Madame Jodzka at the door. "Oh, damn fuss about nothing," she heard him muttering in that voice. And then as they closed the door and stood a moment in the darkened passage, he did suddenly an unexpected thing. He took the Polish woman in his arms, held her fiercely to him for a second, kissed her vehemently, and flung her away. "Bless you, and thank you," he said in a low, angry voice. "You did your best. You made a great fight, but I got what I deserved. I've been waiting years for it." And he was off downstairs to his own quarters. Halfway down, he stopped and looked up to where she stood against the rails. "Tell the doctor," he whispered hoarsely, "that I took a sleeping draught, an overdose," and he was gone. And this was roughly what she did tell the doctor next morning when a hurried telephone summons brought him to the bed whereon a dead man lay with a swollen, blackened tongue. She told the same tale at the inquest too, and an emptied bottle of a powerful sleeping draught supported her. And Monica, too young to realize grief beyond its trumpery meaning of a selfishly felt loss, never once, oddly enough, referred to the absence of her lovely doll that had comforted so many hours, proved such an intimate companion day and night in a life that held no other playmates. It seemed forgotten, expunged utterly from her memory, as though it had never existed at all. She stared blankly, stupidly, when a doll was mentioned. She preferred her worn-out teddy bears. The slate of memory in this particular case was wiped clean. "They're so warm and comfy," she described her bears, "and they cuddle without tickling. Besides," she added innocently, "they don't squeak and try to slip away." Thus in the suburbs, where great spaces between the lamps go dead at night, where the moist wind comes whispering through the mournful branches of the silver pines, where nothing happens and people cry, "Let's go to town," there are occasional stirrings among the dead, dry bones that hide behind villa walls. Today's story was The Doll by Algernon Blackwood. It was read by Jasper L'Estrange. If you enjoy the show, why not become a patron on Patreon and gain access to exclusive content? It's the surest way to help me keep creating. You can also buy me a coffee, like, subscribe, comment, share, follow on social media, and read the description for more information about the show and how you can engage with it. Until next time, sweet dreams.